Hey there, and welcome to Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. This week we have a fascinating episode with Mary Elizabeth Walters. We're talking about 1999 Kosovo Refugee Crisis, and there's a whole lot there involving Albania, NATO, and the United States. You're definitely going to want to stick around for the entire conversation. Thanks again for listening to the Hour of History podcast. It's my pleasure to bring you great episodes every Saturday. There's also content at hourofhistory.com, so you're definitely going to want to check out the website after you listen to this fabulous podcast. Mary has sent along some pictures and maps and additional reading for you to do, especially if you are interested in what is one of the most beautiful areas in the world, the Balkans. Thanks once again for listening on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
So I have with me right now Mary Elizabeth Walters. Welcome to Hour of History. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So I am a predoctoral fellow at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. And I am also a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And my specialty is military history, and I work on the Kosovo War in 1999.
Very cool. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into military history or even history more general?
I grew up doing history with my family. Anytime we went somewhere, we always stopped at the nearby historical site. Our vacations were very atypical. So some of my earliest memories are going to castles in England. And I still have a pet obsession with castles. That's another matter. I fell into military history because in 8th grade, I had to do a National History Day project. And that year, the theme was communication, which as an 8th grader seemed terribly boring. And so I went to do a group project with one of my friends who had the idea of, hey, I saw this documentary on the History Channel last night. There are these crazy guys who jumped into Normandy on D-Day. Let's do them. So as an 8th grader, I emailed the National Pathfinder Association and went, hi, I'm an 8th grader in rural South Carolina, and I have a school project. Please help. And they responded, and it snowballed. They put me in touch with one veteran from the 101st Airborne, and from there, it seemed like everyone knew that I was collecting stories. And pretty much from the 8th grade, I got hooked.
That's, as someone who has taught middle school, that's incredibly inspiring to hear that someone could even remember something that happened in 8th grade, much less, hold on to it and grow from it. That's fantastic. And now you've been pursuing a PhD in military history. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So UNC has a strong program in military history. And my particular focus is the Kosovo War in 1999, and in particular, kind of two pieces. One is how the U.S. military and NATO became the leaders of international humanitarian assistance. And then two, the role of Albanians in providing refugee assistance. Some 66% of refugees in Albania actually stayed in the homes of Albanians. So my dissertation is looking at adding those two pieces of refugee assistance into the narrative.
Wow, that's very interesting. And it's not, I guess, what people typically think of when they're thinking of this humanitarianism.
Yeah. No, you don't really think about poor villagers or Marines as being humanitarian workers.
Interesting. And we'll certainly talk more about that as the show goes on, but Albania is also a really interesting place. How does one get into Albania?
You kind of fall into it.
Mm.
So
And
I got started on Kosovo. I was assigned a paper when I was a study abroad student at King's College London. And I have to admit, I had to Google where Kosovo was because I had no idea. And from there, I got started working on NATO's intervention. And then by the time I was applying to grad school, I was thinking, okay, what I'm really interested in is military involvement in refugee assistance. And so I started learning Serbo-Croatian because UNC offered classes on it. Got to Serbia, realized that as an American, working in Kosovo and Serbia is not really the easiest thing ever. And so then in my second year of grad school, I started learning Albanian. I don't know that I'd recommend trying to learn languages in grad school, but that's what I did. And fortunately, I was able to get funding to do a lot of immersion study and pretty much became fluent in about 6 months.
wow.
Again, I wouldn't recommend doing that, but it worked.
That's fascinating. You know, a lot of this is another really sort of inspiring, good example of languages and languages being taught. A lot of schools seem to be rolling this back a little bit, and you know, Serbo-Croatian isn't exactly the most commonly taught language, but I imagine those language classes really had an impact.
They did. Having that resource and then having funding available for language study from particularly the Foreign Language Area Studies grant from the Department of Education made a huge difference. The type of area studies work I do would be impossible without that type of support.
And there's this myth that Americans are like kind of incapable of languages or whatever, but I mean, you tackled some of the most difficult languages in the world.
I think a lot of it's how you're taught. If you're taught, I don't do well in a standard language class. I can learn all the grammar rules, but implementing them would be impossible. For me, it takes immersion. If you're living with a host family in Tirana, Albania, and your host mother does not speak a word of English, and in fact speaks in the Tirana dialect of Albanian, so not even standard, that's a lot of motivation to learn really fast.
It's a survival skill for sure. And Albanian's kind of an isolated language, isn't it?
It is. It's Indo-European, but it's not part of any of the major language families. So it's not a Slavic language. It's not a Romance language. It's got borrow words from both of them. So refugee in Albanian is refugiat. Makes sense. But in terms of the core of the language, no, it's very much its own thing.
That's fantastic. And so before we get into maybe some of the more detailed questions about your research, perhaps you could just talk a little bit about that immersion experience, because I know there's a lot of those critical language grants out there, and people, especially listeners in the United States, might not know what sort of opportunities those are or what the experience is living like with a host family abroad.
Definitely. So in terms of funding opportunities, the FLAS is a fantastic one. It is tied to school. So if your school doesn't have it, that makes it a lot more difficult to get a FLAS. That being said, some of the main US-based university language schools, places like the Critical Language Institutes at Arizona State University, have their own FLAS funding, and if you're going to one of their summer programs, you can still qualify for one of their FLASs. So don't give up if your school doesn't have FLAS. As you mentioned, there's also the Critical Language Scholarship and Fellowship. Those are open to a smaller number of languages. It changes year by year, but usually about 8 languages qualify. You can also get some of this through the Boren Scholarship at the undergraduate level and the Boren Fellowship at the graduate level. This is actually how I funded my year of research in Albania, was through Boren. But part of that fellowship is also language acquisition, which can be either taking it at the beginner level, or in my case, going from some proficiency to being kind of fluent at a more professional level. So that answers the funding bit. And then in terms of the experience, it can be really hard. So I lived with several host families in Albania, and they were absolutely fantastic people, and they very much took me into their homes and into their families, which in Albania as a single woman means that my host mother would ask where I was going for the whole day. She'd want to know everyone I was meeting with, what my plans for lunch were, when I would be back. If I was running late, I had to call, let her know I was going to be late. The whole neighborhood was interested in their American. They wanted to know what I was doing. They wanted to know how I was eating. Was I eating enough? In Albania, the answer was always no. Apparently, I wasn't eating enough. If my host mom thought that I wasn't dressed warmly enough, she'd send me back to my room to change before I could go to the archive. That takes a lot of getting used to.
I would imagine.
It was a little weird to come back to the US and make decisions about what was I going to eat for dinner. Because in Albania, for most of the year, I was eating with my host family, which meant that I had no say. So it can be a really challenging experience, but it's also incredibly rewarding to become part of someone else. To have a new family, I guess, is a better way to put it.
Very interesting.
To build those relationships.
And did you feel being an American or being a woman that changed potentially changed the experience? You mentioned a little bit of how that might have shifted the host mother's perspective.
Definitely. I mean, so when I was with a host family in the capital, it was part of a language program to do the immersion language training. When I left to go to some of my field sites in different parts of Albania, I continued to stay with families, in part because in Albania, it's not really socially acceptable for a young single woman to live on her own. So if you were a man doing similar work in Albania, you wouldn't have to worry about that. So it'd be easier to get your own apartment. On the other hand, you'd lose out on a lot of those community connections that you get from having a host family. Frankly, one of the biggest differences would have been in terms of alcohol. In Albania, there's an important toasting culture with the local raki, which is their hard alcohol beverage. And if you go to visit someone in their home, for example, to do an oral history, then particularly if you're a man, you have to drink with your host, or it's a huge insult. If you're a woman, you often are offered a non-alcoholic beverage, or you're not expected to keep up with your host, which I was very grateful for.
Wow. And you're dealing with history that's not that far in the past. It seems like there's a lot of overlap maybe with anthropology and some other disciplines.
Definitely. The field of oral history, which I draw on a lot, has a decent amount in common with anthropology and ethnography, but with some differences. So oral history comes out of the kind of wave of social history, and it's about creating an archive that includes people who often would only be part of a statistic. An individual villager isn't going to show up in an archive except on a census record. Oral history, you can bring their lives into the archive. So part of my methodology in doing the oral history was doing all the paperwork so that I have all the permissions that I can donate the oral histories to an archive. So that future historians can use these resources as well. Admittedly, most of the interviews are in Albanian, so that does rather narrow the field of who can use it, but still.
Yeah.
That was an intentionally built into my project, and bringing them into kind of the directing where the interview went in a way. So if they wanted to talk about a topic I hadn't even thought of, then that's what we spent our interview doing.
Oh, cool. And so at the same time, you're not only making, writing history and thinking about history, but you're also creating an archive for future generations, which is kind of incredible. It's a lot of things. Now, the Kosovo war, the refugee crisis in Albania, these are things that, even though they're recent history, like you said, a lot of people, and considering the U.S. involvement and sort of the global response with NATO, people still might not understand a whole lot. Could you just give us a brief background of what happened now 20 years ago?
Sure. Although I think it helps to actually back up even further than 20 years.
Awesome.
Because it's tied to the breakdown of Yugoslavia in the 90s. You can't really think of the Kosovo War in 99 without also thinking about the wars in Bosnia before that. So when Yugoslavia begins to break down, it starts actually in Kosovo. In 89, Slobodan Milosevic revokes the kind of autonomy of two provinces of the Republic of Serbia within Yugoslavia. These are the provinces of Kosovo and the Vojvodina. Doing so makes the other republics of Yugoslavia afraid that Serbia is going to come after them next. And it also shifted the voting dynamics among the republics and started to shift that weight towards Serbia. So you get the Declaration of Independences from Slovenia and Croatia first, and then Bosnia and the war in Bosnia. Now, when the war in Bosnia ends in 1995 with the Dayton Agreement, Kosovo isn't part of that. By that point, there was a peaceful resistance movement in Kosovo, led by Ibrahim Rugova. He tries to get a seat at the table. He's told no. He goes back to Kosovo, and the lesson a lot of Kosovars take, particularly the youth, is that the reason why Bosnia got its independence was because blood was spilled. So the only way to achieve autonomy or independence for Kosovo would be through violence. 2 years later, you get the emergence of the Kosovo Liberation Army. In 1998, things start to hit a crescendo in Kosovo. You get a small refugee crisis, and about 200,000 ethnic Albanians in Kosovo are displaced within Kosovo. Another 20 to 50,000 become refugees in northern Albania. There's a wave of diplomacy, and it seems to have settled down by about November. And then the next year, in 1999, international observers record a massacre at Racak. And from there, things get worse, and there's a new campaign of ethnic cleansing. Again, there's negotiations that try to take place. There's a peace deal proposed at Rambouillet, France. The ethnic Albanians in Kosovo accept it. The Serbs say no. NATO launches Operation Allied Force on March 24th, which lasts for 78 days and ends in June, on June 10th. In that time, about 950,000 ethnic Albanians from Kosovo become refugees. Another 500,000 are displaced within Kosovo. in all, almost 90% of the ethnic Albanian population in Kosovo is displaced from their homes at some point during the crisis. It also ends really quickly. So most refugees are back in Kosovo by the end of July.
Whoa.
So it's a very short, very intense crisis.
And there's a whole lot there that is, it grabs the attention. There's a lot of difference historically that you could go back centuries. When you're studying particularly these groups in Kosovo, can you give us a little image of maybe how diverse Kosovo is as an area, how big it is, and are people who live there, have they lived there for centuries? What kind of people are being displaced?
Ooh, that gets very touchy. Let's start with the size. That's not controversial. So Kosovo is tiny. It's about the size of Connecticut, with a smaller population. In terms of who's living there, by 99, you're looking at about 90% ethnic Albanian and about 10% ethnic Serb, and somewhere in there you have a couple of smaller minorities. There had been some relocation of refugees that had lived in Bosnia, so ethnic Serb refugees that had recently been relocated to Kosovo. You have a small Roma population, but really you're looking at a majority ethnic Albanian population and a minority Serb population. Now in 99, it's the minority Serb population that controls industry, controls government. The ethnic Albanian population is really living as second-class citizens. They've been forced out a lot of these positions and actually have set up parallel school and government structures because of their inability to access the official ones. In terms of how long they've been living there, it depends on who you talk to. Both populations will say that they've been there the longest. Historians continue to debate it. The evidence itself is ambiguous and is often read different ways.
And so we have this issue that seems not unique to the Balkans. We have these kind of conflicts or, battles over land or disagreements on who was there first. It seems like throughout the world. Why is this one particularly violent? Or maybe why does the US and NATO feel a need to respond to this crisis?
A couple of reasons. The first goes back to Bosnia in the first half of the 1990s, when the US and NATO were really slow to act. There's a great quote from Madeleine Albright in 1998 as they're starting to grapple with what do we do about Kosovo, and she said something along the lines of, the world watched as Bosnia burned, and history will not be kind to us if we do the same in Kosovo. And I think that was a lot of it, was this feeling that they had allowed ethnic cleansing and genocide to happen in Bosnia, and they couldn't do that again in Kosovo. And keep in mind, Kosovo is an hour and a half flight from Rome. It's about an hour from Berlin, maybe 3 hours from London. I mean, this is in Europe. And they're having ethnic cleansing and the potential for genocide again in Europe, and it's just about to be the 21st century. The other piece is that it's happening right as NATO is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And
they want to feel important.
They do. They want to feel important, and they're super insecure. I mean, NATO had been founded provide a bulwark against the Soviet threat. The Soviet Union no longer exists. By 1999, a lot of people are asking, should NATO exist at all? What is the purpose of NATO? So in this, NATO finds a new purpose. There's also a lot of concern that if the war in Kosovo is allowed to continue, that it's going to destabilize the entire region, in part through the refugees. It could spark broader ethnic Albanian uprisings. There's large Albanian populations in not only Kosovo, but in other parts of Serbia and Montenegro and Macedonia. There's an Albanian community in Turkey. So there's a lot of concern that it could have spillover violence, that the presence of the refugees could destabilize other regimes, not least of which is Albania, which was coming out of its own period of financial collapse and near civil war in 1997, and then what might have been a coup attempt in 1998. I mean, so this is not a region that is stable. And so NATO is looking at this going, okay, this instability could affect all of Europe.
And it's kind of interesting that you have a military organization then that is also at the same time kind of branding itself as humanitarian in action, or keeping peace or stabilizing. Can you talk a little bit about words and some important words for this conflict, and how you go about defining them?
Yeah, I mean, so NATO was very keen to portray themselves as acting to protect the human rights and humanitarian condition of the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. Their press releases always emphasize that the strategic bombing is to stop the violence against the ethnic Albanians, and to talk about all of the different refugee assistance work that NATO is doing in Albania and Macedonia, which is where the bulk of the refugees were. They're also keen to emphasize that they're not in charge of refugee assistance, that they're doing this to support the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR. They don't want to be in charge of it. They claim they're not in charge of it. But they're definitely portraying themselves as an organization doing a lot of humanitarian work. Now, if you talk to or read the reports from the UNHCR, from other aid organizations, a lot of these organizations are very leery of how involved NATO was. For a couple of reasons. The first is that humanitarianism, in kind of the way most of the main aid organizations in the world operate, is supposed to be neutral. So NATO is working not under clear UN Security Council authorization. They say they are. There's a lot of debate on whether the UN Security Council resolution they refer to actually authorized the bombing campaign or not. But either way, they're in this kind of ambiguous position, and they're an active belligerent in the conflict. On the other hand, the Kosovo Refugee Crisis is very atypical in terms of how fast it develops. So the first major wave of Kosovo refugees hits the northern part of Albania on March 27. 30,000 refugees cross into Albania that night. 3 days later, there's over 100,000 refugees in Albania. By April 7th, there's about 250,000 just in Albania. The only organization that has the logistic capacity to respond at the scale and speed needed is the US military and NATO. Aid organizations can't move that fast, particularly when you're talking about Albania, which has crumbling infrastructure in 1999. For example, the main airport at the start of the crisis could handle about 8 landings and takeoffs a day. So 4 round trip up and down flights. You're not going to get very much aid in with 4.
Mm-mm.
By the time the US Air Force gets in, within a couple of weeks, that same airport is handling between 100 and 200 landings and takeoffs a day.
Wow. And was the US and NATO, well, can we untangle that for a second? How much of the NATO is the US, at least in this instance?
Oh, that is something I have been struggling with for the last 7 years.
Whoa.
So the US deploys a joint task force, Shining Hope, which is a military deployment whose sole purpose is refugee assistance. NATO deploys Operation Allied Harbor. In theory, Shining Hope, at some point during the crisis, comes under the banner of Operation Allied Harbor. In practice, it's not so clear. NATO's ability to direct what the militaries from NATO member states are doing in terms of refugee assistance isn't as clear as in their combat operations, because there are different levels of kind of authority within NATO. So in Operation Allied Force, the bombing campaign, the NATO headquarters has complete control over the bombing. They don't have that level of control when it comes to refugee assistance. So you have the Operation Allied Harbor, but you also have several parallel missions like Shining Hope. The Italians deploy Operation Rainbow, which is a mixed military-civilian operation. They build 8 refugee camps and assist with about 20 others. The UK, France, Belgium, Spain, they're all deploying military units to Albania and Macedonia as well that are providing assistance. But a lot of these aren't clearly being directed by NATO. Some of them are operating kind of separately.
And I study the Quakers, so they tend to get their hands in everything. I would imagine there's some private aid organizations as well.
Oh, definitely. So some 200 aid organizations officially register with the Albanian government. That registry is incomplete. For example, many of the Italian religious charities that documents from the Operation Rainbow discuss are not part of the Albanian registry.
Oh, wow.
And in the course of doing my fieldwork and oral history, charities and aid organizations were mentioned that definitely aren't on that list of 200. So who knows how many were there? A lot of the time you'd get small churches sending over a couple people with a bunch of stuff, and they'd show up somewhere in Albania and hand stuff out and then go home. So you have this really chaotic situation in which you have the overlapping military missions, you have all of these different aid organizations operating there in this kind of very chaotic environment.
Wow. It sounds like almost a precursor or a mirror to what happens in massive scale in Haiti, but with just thousands and thousands of NGOs where oversight is not really possible. But this sounds a little different because there was that powerful organized group there in NATO and the US. Is that?
Yes and no. I mean, so there's a lot of similarities with Haiti. Part of what allows Albania to kind of get away with it is that it's such a short crisis. That you can kind of take the approach of, well, the refugees really, really need help, and Albania is very, very poor. In 1999, it's the poorest country in Europe. And so there's a very limited amount that they can do, even though they're trying very, very hard to help the refugees. They just don't have the ability to do a huge amount. And so taking the approach of, okay, well, we'll just let basically anyone come in who would like to try to help and let them do as much as they can. And if there's duplication of effort, or if there's a couple of gaps, well, at least this way we're getting a lot of things into the country. And if you have a very short crisis, this approach is not the worst possible. But if you're looking at a more sustained long-term problem, then taking this approach is a disaster in waiting.
Were Albanians skeptical at all of the outside aid? Because Albania had such a long history during the Cold War of being this kind of like hermit kingdom that was not, interacting with other nations a whole lot.
It very much depends on which organization they're interacting with. Albanians love the US and they love NATO. On the other hand, in a year's worth of media coverage from one of the main Albanian newspapers, there was not a single positive article on any aid organization.
Wow.
So you have this kind of dualness where lots of positive reporting on the US military and on NATO, lots of positive memories of them and oral histories, not so much with aid organizations. And at the time, the Albanian government was actually really distrustful of the UN High Commission for Refugees. In the 1998 crisis that I mentioned, the UN had focused on the 200,000 Kosovars or ethnic Albanians who were displaced within Kosovo, which makes sense. By UNHCR standards, a refugee crisis of some 20 to 50,000 refugees in northern Albania isn't a big deal. So they sent some help, but it wasn't their focus. For the Albanian government, this is massive. They've just come out of a year of total collapse. Their government is barely functioning. Their economy is still in tatters. They have no experience helping refugees. And the UNHCR is clearly not paying that much attention. And then in early 1999, the Albanian government starts to go to the UNHCR and go, okay, we're getting really concerning reports at our northern border. Are you all ready for a refugee crisis? Are you guys going to be able to help us? And the UNHCR promises on multiple occasions, yes, that they have 10,000 tents in the country, that they're ready to help, X number of refugees. The refugee crisis starts, and it turns out the UNHCR didn't have any of that in Albania.
Wow.
That they were referring to a warehouse in Belgrade, in Serbia.
Oh, no.
Which the Serbian government confiscated and gave to the Serbian branch of the Red Cross.
Oh.
So all of their supplies that they were using to make these references were actually in Serbia.
Wow.
So because of that, the Albanian government and the UNHCR don't work well together for most of the crisis.
It sounds like the UNHCR doesn't work well alone in the but that could it's kind of stems from this just understanding that seems to have really a misunderstanding of the Balkans that seems to be a familiar trope. Now, you focus then also on this alternative type of humanitarianism where Albanians kind of open their homes. What is that all about?
Right. So in Albania, there's a tradition that's called Mik Pritje, which roughly translates to hospitality, but with a whole lot more cultural weight than hospitality. So in Albanian customary law, particularly the Kanun I Lektu Kujini, if a guest or a traveler comes to your home and they knock on your door, then you, as the owner of the house, have to take them in. The saying is that you have to welcome them with bread, salt, and heart. As long as they're under your roof, you are responsible for their welfare and their safety. If they insult someone else in the village, instead of them being responsible for the resulting blood feud, you as their host are responsible.
Whoa.
So this is a very, very important concept in Albania. Even today, hospitality is a key part of the social fabric and social interactions. So by the time we get to 1999, Mikritia wasn't actively being practiced. I mean, the decades of communism had really stamped out a lot of Albanian customary law. But what happens in this moment of arrival, Albanians reimagine what Mikritia is, and they use Mikritia to understand their role in the crisis and how they can help the refugees. And so they offered to take in the refugees into their homes. And instead of just taking them in as travelers for a night or two, they're taking these families in for the entirety of the crisis sometimes, so 3 months. And instead of just taking 1 or 2 travelers, they're taking in families. I think the average in Albania is about 11. I have accounts of people taking in over 100.
Whoa.
I think one of the best examples I can give you is, so on March 27th, when the first major wave of refugees arrived in the town of Kukas in northern Albania near one of the main border crossings, the local mayor goes on the local television and asks that anyone who has a room, can you please come to the town square and take home refugees, because they had run out of places to put them in the cultural center downtown or in the schools and in the mosque. They didn't know what to do with these refugees. So within about 30 minutes, the town square is inundated with both people from the town of Kukas and the surrounding area who want to take home refugees. And there's a story that gets told in Kukas about a near fight that breaks out late that night between 2 Albanian patriarchs, because there was only one family of refugees left, and both men wanted that family. So the prefect, kind of like the governor of this area, has to intervene, Jamal Alizi, and he has to separate the 2 men, and he promises them that if they just wait, there'll be more refugees the next day. So if they come back in the morning, they'll be able to take home as many refugees as you want. Now, can you imagine in America 2 people fighting over the privilege and the honor of taking home strangers?
No.
It's almost unimaginable.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And so now you're hearing these stories from asking people, do they get, what is the sort of emotion they have? Do they have like fond memories? Is there anger? How do they feel telling you these stories?
Albanians are very proud of what they accomplished in 1999. As you mentioned, Albania is often most known for how isolated it was under communism. That the country is dotted with these little concrete bunkers. And then in the 90s, they feel like they lost themselves, that they were violent and barbaric, and that's what the world thought of them because of the scenes of people trying to get out in 91, 92, and storming the embassies in Tirana to try to get visas so they could get out of the country. And then in 97, when the country collapses into anarchy. And then 99 comes around and they rediscover the nobility of being Albanian. That they take these refugees into their homes for 3 months. And so in Albania, it's very much the story of national redemption. Now in Kosovo, it gets a little different if you're talking to former refugees. They tend to be, on the one hand, very grateful for the help that they received in Kosovo and the people who took them in, the families. And a lot of these Albanian and Kosovar families are still in touch with each other. They're still part of each other's lives, and they go to weddings and celebrations with each other. But in Kosovo, you'll also hear a lot about how shocked they were when they got to Albania and they realized how poor Albania was, and how poor these families who had taken them in were, and how horrified they were about how much they were struggling to put food on the table. So a lot of the folks I talked to in Kosovo would talk about how once they kind of had gotten a little bit settled and could get in touch with family members living in other countries, for example, in Germany or Switzerland, and they could start getting money sent to them, that they would give money to their Albanian host families because they felt bad for their host families. I mean, so these are refugees who've just lost everything they own, and they're feeling bad about how poor their hosts are, which I think also speaks to how poor Albania was in 1999.
Yeah, and so Kosovo is not part of Albania. You know, it's not recognized by Serbia. It's in kind of this middle existence. What is it like to be in Kosovo and to talk about these recent events with people?
Kosovo is absolutely beautiful. And it can be jarring because you'll be going along and everything is perfectly normal, and then you'll see something that reminds you that things aren't as settled. So if you go to the Dachani monastery outside of Jakova, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, if I'm remembering that right. It's absolutely stunning medieval Serbian monastery. Beautiful. And to this day, it still has NATO peacekeepers guarding it.
Wow.
It's nothing quite like not realizing that your bus is going to drop you off several miles away at the village that bears the same name, and walking up to the vehicle checkpoint and having the peacekeepers with guns looking at you going, "Why are you walking?" A roadblock.
But you can still...
and they go, "Oh, of course it's an American who's doing this, right?"
But you can still do it as an American.
Absolutely. And Kosovo most of Kosovo remains very safe. And in some places, actually, a lot of the NATO presence has been reduced. So there's another Serbian monastery in the city, outside of the city of Peja in Kosovo, which in the past had NATO peacekeepers. When I was there in 2016, it had 2 police officers, 1 Albanian and 1 Serbian. And both of them explained that they were there because an agreement said they had to be, but that they never had any problems and they really didn't see the point of being there. So that, I think, is a really promising example of a shift in climate. That you don't need the heavy militarized presence. But that very much is dependent on where you are in Kosovo.
And there's this thing, this it's sort of inescapable, I guess, sense of loss. I've read it described as sort of like, peace can be made, but at the end of the day, if you still lost your son or your daughter, there's that sort of chance that this person snaps and wants to get revenge or wants to, take the eye for an eye, I guess. Not asking you to look into a crystal ball or predict the future or anything, but what steps do you see as ways to sort of prevent this area, which has had so many issues in the last 20 years from going back to where it was?
Ooh. I think recognizing that the loss is there is really important. A happy account from my interviews with former refugees is that they only lost their home and everything in it. That's a good outcome. It's far more often that you hear that they have a family member that they don't know where they are, they're among the missing, or confirmed dead. That pain is very evident in Kosovo. There's a charity in the town of Suareka that provides after-school art to children. And you'll get children, 8 or 10, born well after the war, and they'll draw images of the stories they've heard of family members being killed.
Oh.
So you're looking at intergenerational trauma, not just in Kosovo, but throughout the Balkans. Beyond that, a huge factor that would help with stability is economic investment and economic opportunity. But the United States and the European Union have dramatically cut their aid and development budgets in Kosovo and Bosnia. This is a huge problem. The unemployment rates are astronomical, particularly youth unemployment rates. Statistically, that's a bad indicator. When you have a lot of young men without jobs and without the prospect of getting a job, that's bad. It's also created a vacuum in which religious extremist organizations can come in and offer food and money in return of going to, an extremist mosque, for example. And it's not that, maybe the people involved want to be part of a really extremist organization, but it offers economic stability. So increasing aid budgets, increasing development budgets is really important to ensuring security. The other piece is continuing to support NATO and continuing to support NATO presence in Kosovo and to support an international military presence in Bosnia. All of these things help to stabilize the area.
Now, those are all fantastic suggestions, and give us something to kind of think about in any area that's had trauma, for sure, and there are a lot of them. One thing, though, particular also to this region, is I've heard people talking about like sort of a good old days. Well, back when it was Yugoslavia under Tito, everyone was equal or everyone was the same. Did you find any sort of nostalgia like that when you were there?
You'll get that in Bosnia and Serbia and sometimes in Croatia. You won't find that among ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. In comparison to the 90s, yes, there were times when life under communist Yugoslavia was better for them. There were also a lot of periods of really, really brutal oppression by Tito and communist Yugoslavia. So they look back on it and it's a far more mixed memory than you get in some of the other parts of Yugoslavia.
Fascinating. Unfortunately, we're drawing near the end of the hour, but fortunately we get to that point where you get to offer a suggestion. The suggestion can be anything. We've had a wide range. What would you like to suggest to the Hour of History listeners, Mary?
Travel somewhere you've never thought you'd travel. Awesome. It doesn't have to be abroad. I've taken it to the extreme at times. But even in your own home state, if you go off the beaten path, everything around you has a history that you've never thought about. is you just take the time to slow down and look.
Can you share one particular, I mean, you shared your whole Albania experience, but maybe another travel that sort of opened your eyes in a way you didn't think you could have imagined?
Ooh. Yeah, I'd say the most jarring one was in Arizona.
Huh.
My mom and I did a driving trip. We went to the Red Canyons, and then up to the Grand Canyon, and then the Painted Desert. And part of that trip, we went through a Native American reservation. And realizing that what I thought was a shed was someone's home really brought home to me as a child the fact that my history class's rosy view on someone like Andrew Jackson missed a lot of the story. So I think for me, that was my going off the beaten path, off the interstate, seeing a different part of America.
Very cool. Yeah, those moments can certainly have an impact and change your perspective. And there's a lot of those, especially if you're in the United States. I know we have listeners all over the world, but the United States is a huge place, and oftentimes Americans are going elsewhere when we have our own exploring to do. So my suggestion is, I'm not sure how I feel doing this about an episode that focused on Kosovo and Albania, but I was lucky enough to travel in the Balkans years ago, and before I went, I read Ivo Andrić's The Bridge on the Drina.
Excellent book.
Yeah, I figured you would have read it, and you know, it does untangle some of the complexity, but it also keeps it messy in explaining this incredibly diverse and incredibly beautiful part of the world that a lot of people don't really know about. So it's a fantastic book, and you know, I'm sure you've heard it in this conversation, but if you're looking for a place to travel off the beaten path, highly recommended. The Balkans.
Definitely. It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. Well, it's been nice having you on the show, Mary. Now,
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're coming to a, you know, big moment in your historical career. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us, or anything that has you excited in the future?
Ooh, well, I will be moving to my next challenge in the fall. I will be joining the faculty at Kansas State. So I will be taking the Balkans to Kansas. Wow,
congratulations. That's an excellent achievement, and I'm sure your students and the faculty that you're joining are going to be happy to have you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check out hourofhistory.com/Rex for all the recommendations mentioned during the show. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, be sure to head over to our blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, where you'll find topics that were covered in the podcast as well as others. And that concludes this week's episode. We thank you again for listening, and we hope to have you back here next week at the Hour of History podcast.